Robin Hood Radio and the Robin Hood Radio Network is proud to present Leonard Lopate at Large, lively hour-long in-depth discussions providing overviews and context to topics usually covered in partial measures. His guests include leading thinkers, scientists, artists, economists, farmers, historians, authors, and politicians. Mr. Lopate is a Peabody Award winner whose numerous honors include 3 Associated Press Awards and 3 James Beard Awards.
Welcome to Leonard Lopate at Large. I'm Leonard Lopate. Peter Aaron, an architectural photographer, and Brooke Allen, an author and professor, went to Syria on vacation with their children in 2009. Brooke wrote a book about their experiences called The Other Side of the Mirror, an American travels through Syria. It's published by Paul Dry Books. But within 2 years of their trip, civil war broke out in Syria, and many of the landmarks that Peter had photographed, historic mosques, Roman ruins, ancient citadels, were damaged or destroyed. His photographs, which now serve as documentation of Syria's history and culture, are currently on exhibit at the Venice Biennale and have been published in a new book that accompanies the show called Syria Before the Deluge. I'm very pleased to welcome Brooke Allen and Peter Aaron to our show today. Hello.
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 Brooke, you say you decided to go to Syria because of your interest in the early Christian monks in Syria?
Well, kind of. We had some friends who were interested in that subject, and they'd read a book by William Dalrymple called, I think it's called Beyond the Holy Mountain. Syria was a center of early Christianity.
Wasn't it also where Judaism began?
Well,
wasn't Abraham supposed to have lived?
Yes, the Canaanites. They're all there. Abraham is supposed to have lived in Aleppo. But this is what really got our friends kicked off. So we knew nothing about it at all. So we thought, well, we'll go with them. That's all good. That'll be fine. So we got our tickets, and we had 2 16-year-old daughters at the time, our twins, and the 4 of us made plans to go. Our friends copped out, so we just went on our own and toured the country. And it was by far the most remarkable place I've ever been in my life for cultural tourism. And we thought. We were there for 2 weeks. I went back and spent a month later in the year, and we thought we'd be going back for the rest of our lives. We thought we'd go back every couple of years and see more. And of course, it didn't work out that way. The war started about a year and a half after we were there, I think. And we've just since then have been reading reports of the destruction of people, places, sites. It's just been horrifying.
Why did the story of Saint Simeon Stylites, or Stylites, I guess, intrigue you? Had you seen Louis Buñuel's film Simon of the Desert?
We saw it after we went to the site of Saint Simon Stylites.
Actually, there were 2 Simon Stylites, father and son, the elder and the younger.
Well, there were a lot of Stylites. It was a fad in the 5th century to stand on huge pillars. I think it grew out of some earlier, even more bizarre pagan ritual, the so-called Syrian goddess, and people would stand on giant phalluses that were all around the place, and they would stand up there for days. And then this sort of translated into a Christian practice with these Syrian monks who would compete to see who could be more ascetic than the next one.
And he had a strong sense of self-denial. He had been a shepherd. Then he stood on the pillar and preached and gave counsel for 38 years as a hermit.
Yes, 38
wow.
years. And I think the pillar was 40 feet high, so people would send his food up in a basket, and we were naturally curious about, what happens to the feces, and those apparently were holy relics. Anyway, he was a bit of showman for sure, and had a lot.
Where did he sleep? It was it was 6 feet by 6 feet or something.
I don't know how wide it was at the
9
time.
feet, I think.
Now
it was
you
3
can
yards.
see it now, but it's only about 6 feet high now because so many pilgrims have taken pieces of it away over the 1,500 years since then. So what's left is not a very impressive structure.
Well, this was a center, Syria, of Christianity, early Christianity. Are there any Christians or many Christians in Syria today?
Well, there were plenty in 2009 when we went there. There were 10% of the population was Christian, and they lived. It was a good place to be a Christian, and it was also a good place to be a Jew up until 1947 when the State of Israel was declared. But there was a the Christian population had plenty of special privileges and rights, and lived. And we, in Damascus, when we first got there, our very first week, we were staying in the Christian quarter, and it was Easter week, and it was very active. There were church processions all over the place. Down at the bottom of where we were living, there were a lot of little chicks running around. They were being sold for Easter chicks. There were bands, there were orchestras, the Christian restaurants and bars down there, they were all sort of serving alcohol, and people were gambling on the Sabbath, on the Muslim Sabbath. I mean, they had their rights and privileges. It was fine until the Civil War.
And Peter, how large is Syria? Do you know? Is it the size of some states?
It's about the size of New York State.
Uh-huh.
But of course, it's morphed over the centuries. I mean, originally it was much bigger, and after World War I is when it got slimmed down to its present size.
How did you travel through the country?
We had a driver. When Peter and I were there for 2 weeks with the girls, we had a driver the whole time.
And was the driver also a guide?
Yes, he was not bad. He was good. He was very genial. We were sort of under the impression when we went there that it was difficult to travel around by ourselves, so we thought we'd be better with a driver and a guide. But in fact, that wasn't really true. So when I went back with my friend later in the year, we occasionally had a driver, but mostly we got around on buses and minivans.
And were you restricted from certain areas? Was there a visible police presence?
No, not at all. Do you remember anything, Peter? Being restricted from anything?
No, I thought we were welcome wherever we went, and
when you were taking pictures, nobody said no, you can't take a picture of that.
No, there seemed to be no restriction. People talked to us, and it seemed like
we went into mosques. And they would give you a special garb to wear if you're going into a mosque. They had a little changing room, and if you were a tourist, you put this robe on over what you were wearing. But we were not. There was nowhere we not only were we allowed in places, we went into a hammam, like a bath, but they still have these baths that are descended from the Roman baths. We went into one that was 1,000 years old. It was still in use, and the guy paraded us right through while these men were in there having their baths. So it was pretty open. Yes.
You brought your daughters. How old were they at that time?
They were 16 years old.
And as Westerners, did the girls attract much attention?
The girls attract attention wherever they go, and at that time, again, we had misconceptions about the country at this point. We thought, we're going to have to wear headscarves and this kind of thing, and we said, which is not true. We said to the girls, you might want to tone down your personal style a little bit, and maybe button your blouses up a little higher, and they just paid no attention whatsoever to us, and they were greeted, ecstatically by all the locals, and it was unlike France or Italy. Nobody tried to paw them.
Although someone did joke that you could trade your daughters for a lot of camels.
Yes, somebody offered us 1,000 camels for half joking. I wasn't sure whether he was joking or not. She was such a pain in the neck at that stage of her life that we thought about taking him up on it. It's not always easy to travel with 16-year-olds, but they were. It was wonderful. I mean, the people there were not sleazy in their regard for these girls. Nobody tried to grope them. Nobody was rude, but they certainly attracted positive attention and opened doors for me and Peter, for sure.
Were you afraid before you went that Syrians might be hostile toward Americans?
Yes. Yes.
So did you hear any anti-American sentiments?
No. They're very...
We met one man who said, you're from America. You must be very brave to come here, and it was tongue-in-cheek because there were so many Europeans visiting, and the axis of evil had been declared, though Syria was not among those countries.
Its neighbor Iraq was.
Right.
That's right.
But were there other Americans there?
We only saw one or two.
We met this one terrific character, an older guy who was from Louisiana, and he went to Syria and Iran. He obviously had plenty of money, was retired, and he said, I'm going to spend the rest of my life traveling in Syria and Iran because they beat everywhere else for what you can see. And, certainly was right.
That was then anyway.
That was then, and he was certainly right in the case of Syria. We haven't yet been to Iran, although I'd like to.
What questions were you asked most frequently? What were Syrians curious about?
everything, right? I mean, people, we'd been to Turkey, and, people want to sell you something, so they invite you into their shop, and they're very pleasant, but they do want to sell you something. In Syria, there was nothing like that. They really wanted to sit down and talk to you. And the very first night we were there, I went out by myself and went down to the souk, to the market, which was open at night. And this man came running out and wanted to show me a picture of himself with John Kerry, who had been there recently, and was asking about politics and just curious about everything, truly, because they don't meet a lot of Americans. They didn't meet a lot of Americans.
Peter, what drew you to the field of architectural photography?
Well, I'd go back to my bar mitzvah when I was given a camera by my parents, and I took to the whole thing about developing pictures and.
Oh, you got an enlarger and a home darkroom?
That's true, and I became the photo editor of the Riverdale Junior High School newspaper, and then the DeWitt Clinton in the Bronx high school newspaper, and then Bard College newspaper and magazine. But I never went for a degree in photography because in 1968, I don't think many schools would have had such a thing. It was physics. So then,
well, you could have been an art major with an emphasis on photography, no?
Right, but I expressed myself in my youth through science more than with self-expression.
So do you think that scientific bent is the reason that you went toward architectural photography rather than taking pictures of people or
no question
or products or some of the other things that photographers do?
No, I like the idea of a subject that didn't talk back to me and that I could have more control and not have to have a dialogue with it. So at a certain point, I realized that I would like to hone my skills and treat it as a profession.
And you were an assistant for Ezra Stoller.
Well, that's what happened. I asked Ezra Stoller if he would consider interviewing me for a job. And sometime around 1971 or 2, he hired me, and we began traveling around the United States photographing things for Skidmore, Owings and Merrill, and Richard Meyer, and Michael Graves, Robert Stern. And I learned so much from Ezra that it became a foregone conclusion that this was going to be my career, too.
I met another architectural photographer recently who told me that he was so pleased that that was what he concentrated on because all of his photographer friends who took glamour photographs or took pictures of products or whatever found themselves being replaced by younger photographers who came along who could do it exactly the same way that they did for a lot less money, but that as an architectural photographer, he had certain skills that weren't so easy to duplicate.
That's true. There's virtually no other type of photography that you could have smooth sailing with other than this. Something about architects and how you have to know a lot about how to tell the story of a building, even if you've never been there before.
Give a sense of perspective.
And a storyboard, a walkthrough, an ability to show the front, go in the front door, go to all the rooms and up to the attic, and have it be understandable to someone who's never been there. Ezra taught me that, and several other techniques that make it easier to have in your mind's eye what it's like to be there. So the technique of digital photography, while it can replace so many other skills in photography, you still need to move furniture and things that digital's not going to solve.
Do you shoot digitally?
Yeah, and 2005 was the year that the digital camera became as good as 4x5 film. And that was the year that after a period of a month of testing, I switched to digital. It became evident that my life was going to be easier and the pictures were going to be better.
Now, what are the challenges of photographing a building as opposed to some people walking down the street, for example?
Well, exteriors of buildings in New York City are very difficult to capture well. Not only do you need good weather and the right time of day, but there are nightmare scenarios with trucks and barriers and street furniture like traffic lights and bus stop signs and garbage cans that all have to be dealt with.
And then the buildings are all right next to each other. If you're shooting architecture in Chicago, almost every building has an alleyway on both sides, so you can really give a sense of it as a unique entity. But not New York.
No, not New York. And then there's the matter of getting into adjacent buildings, getting permission, figuring out how you can get a good vantage point. It's a much harder job than, say, shooting an interior where you have much more control, where you can change the furniture, rearrange things, change the lighting. Exteriors are unforgiving. You just have to be there at the right time, and you have to be aggressive about getting permission to put up cones so that no one can park. And it's an endless nightmare of difficulties.
This is Leonard Lopate at Large. I'm Leonard Lopate on WBAI 99.5 FM in New York, and I'm talking with Peter Aaron, photographer. He has a book that accompanies his photographic show currently at the Venice Biennale, a great honor. And Brooke Allen, whose book, The Other Side of the Mirror, An American Travels Through Syria, is published by Paul Dry Books. What did you think, what did you intend the photography of the trip to do? I mean, when you went, did you think, oh, I'm going to take pictures of all of these incredible ruins?
It was a very serendipitous thing where many good things came together. First
Did you
of
get
all,
an assignment?
there was no assignment. We were on a vacation. The vacation was 3 weeks. I brought an infrared camera that I had converted. It's a Canon 5D, and it can no longer shoot color film because I sent it to a place in New Jersey where they take off what's called the anti-infrared coating, and the camera can only see infrared from that point on. And I thought I would try it out in Syria. And I thought that these would just be interesting vacation photos. Well, as it turned out, they were more than interesting. It was a perfect subject for this technique. It makes the sky dark, makes the clouds white, it's black and white, makes the ruins full of all kinds of grayscale intricacies. And it just made everything look more monumental than regular color photography. And it needs sunny weather. If you shoot it in cloudy weather, nothing happens. It just looks like black and white. So everything worked out well, and I thought I had a nice group of pictures, but it never occurred to me that they would be the most important pictures I've done in my 40-year career of shooting architecture.
I've had conversations with people who say that they feel that black and white photography looks more real than color photography. For some, I guess because we grew up with black and white images as the images of history.
It seems to elevate things to some kind of ideal. It doesn't look like everyday scenes anymore. It just looks more monumental.
What do you think that these pictures would be less effective if you had shot them in color?
I think so. I brought 2 cameras with me, and I shot everything in color and black and white.
I will just interrupt and say Peter took some fantastic color shots as well.
But they didn't make them to. They didn't make it to the Venice Biennale.
No, I decided it should only be black and white and mostly infrared.
Mm-hmm. So, does infrared give a certain quality to an image that you can't get anywhere else?
Yeah, if you converted a black and white from color and tried to make it look like infrared, you could do that, but certain values wouldn't change significantly. For instance, clothing often turns white. So when you looked at people in Syria at the mosque or walking down the street, sometimes it looked like they were wearing white robes rather than brown or black. And it was very surprising to me. Same thing with grass. Grass and trees all turned white, and that would not happen with just black and white.
Brooke, you're the history enthusiast in the family. How did you come up with your itinerary?
Well, it was pretty serendipitous, as Peter said. We knew we wanted to go to Damascus. We knew we wanted to go to Aleppo. And, these are both of these cities claim to be the oldest cities in the world. And nobody's sure which is older, but they've both been around for about 8 millennia. So that seemed, obviously we were going to go to these places. Palmyra, the city of Palmyra, which is, it's been really almost completely destroyed by ISIS since then. One of the great wonders of the world, desert oasis on the Silk Road, sacked by the Romans in about 300 A.D.
Wait, so this was part of the Silk Road
AD.
coming all the way down from Asia?
Yes. The Silk Road went through Aleppo and it went through Palmyra. And so it was one of these great ruined cities. We knew we wanted to go there. But I didn't know that much before I went. Like Peter, I had no idea we were going to be writing about it and photographing it. We just thought it was a holiday. When I went back with a friend and spent a month, then I was much more systematic and went to some of these Bronze Age sites like Mare and Ebla, and went to some Hittite sites. I mean, just to give an idea, I made a little list actually to show who's been in Syria over the last many millennia. There's Bronze Age sites, the Phoenicians, the Akkadians, the Assyrians. It was conquered by Ramesses II of Egypt. It was conquered by Cyrus of Persia, Alexander the Great. It was part of the Seleucid Empire. It was part of the Roman Empire for 5 centuries. Mark Antony gave it to Cleopatra as a wedding gift.
How nice.
Augustus took it over. It was taken over by the Arabs in 635 A.D. It was a part of the Caliphate. The Seljuk Turks took it over. The Crusaders came. The Mamluks, the Ottoman Empire. It was part of the Ottoman Empire for 500 years. And after that, it was ruled by the French until independence in 1946. So you can imagine the richness of the architectural and archaeological material culture there. It's just unbelievable.
The French got it as part of the after World War I, yes, because the Ottoman Empire had fought on the losing side.
Yeah. So the British and the French dismembered the Ottoman Empire, and the French got Syria and Lebanon, and supposedly under a mandate.
The Brits got Iraq, I guess.
Yes, the Brits got Iraq and Jordan.
Palestine.
And it was supposed to be UN mandates. It was supposed to be, they were supposed to be, sort of taking care of the place rather than ruling it as a part of their colonial empire. But they were very hard to dislodge, the French, once they got there.
You write that you didn't travel to Syria for the landscape or the food, although the food
was
can be
fabulous.
quite remarkable. Simply for the history?
Well, yes, but the food, I have to say, was stunning. It was, we're all familiar with Mediterranean cooking, and it's not unlike Israeli food, I guess, but there were so many surprises in the meals with thousands of beautiful little dishes and extra vegetables, and always an oud player at every restaurant, and it was festive, and it was lovely.
Considering that incredibly rich history that you just listed, why do you think Americans know so little about the history and the culture?
It's remarkable,
of
and
this
of
important
course
country?
that's why I wrote the book, because I thought, oh my Lord, we go to Rome for history, we go to Paris, we don't go to Syria for history. Why not? Here it all is.
Did you see all the traces of those various groups that had
Yes.
controlled the country at one
Yes.
point or another?
I mean, the really old stuff, obviously, the sort of Hittites. Well, you can see traces of all of it. I have to say, it's all there. And what's really tremendous is you go to a place like, like the great mosque, the Umayyad Mosque in Damascus, and before it was a mosque, it was a Byzantine cathedral, and there's still crosses in it and Greek writing. There's something unusual about up until ISIS, about the area was the unwillingness to destroy things from previous civilizations and religions. So the Christian iconography is still there in the mosque. John the Baptist's head is in there, if you can believe it. There's another place, I think, where his head is supposed to be. But people come and they worship John the Baptist's head. And then before that, it was a Roman temple to Jupiter. And bits and pieces of the Roman temple are also still there. So you see the accretion as it happens.
And there is also a synagogue that has frescoes that you probably would not find in synagogues anywhere else in the world.
That's an amazing place. It's a place called Dura Europos, and it's in Mesopotamia, towards the eastern border. And it was
That's what Mesopotamia is. So that was Syria.
Yeah, Syria is now between Mesopotamia is Iraq and Syria there. So in Mesopotamia there was this incredible town called Dura Europos that was a Roman outpost, and in that town at the time of the Romans, late Roman Empire, they have discovered there every kind of pagan temple you can imagine, and it's not a large house. I mean, not a large town. There's a Christian church there. It was so old that churches were still in people's houses then. This is around the 3rd century. There is a Mithraic temple, and they discovered a synagogue, which I believe, so far as I know, is the only synagogue in existence that has figures of humans painted on the walls. Biblical scenes are painted on the walls of this synagogue. Now, they dismantled the whole thing in the 1920s or 30s and took it to the museum in Damascus, which is where I saw it. But if you go to the Jewish Museum in New York, there's a reproduction of it half size that you can walk inside and look around. At least there was. I'm hoping it's still there. It's really remarkable. There's nothing like it. So the people who discovered all this were astounded that in a small place like this, that there would be all three of these major religions, as well as the pagan ones at the same time.
And ancient Syria is often referred to in the Bible, both
Yes.
Old and New Testament.
Yes. And as you were saying, Abraham in Aleppo, it's called Aleppo. I think the original word for milk, it comes from that. And Abraham used to supposedly milk his goats on the top of what's now the Aleppo citadel.
Isn't the road to Damascus the place where the Apostle Paul had visions
Yes.
that led to his Christian conversion?
Yes, he fell down and was blinded by his revelation on the road to Damascus. And then he was brought to Damascus by followers of Christ. And he stayed in the house of a guy called Ananias. And you can actually go to, the foundations of the house are still there, and you can go into the basement. I think Mark Twain said, well, if it wasn't this house, it was another one, and it's just as good. Anyway, it's all there in the neighborhood. And you also can be shown the place where St. Paul was lowered over the walls of Damascus in a basket to escape from the angry Jews.
Why was Syria a center of activity for the Crusaders? The Crusaders built a medieval castle called the Crac des Chevaliers.
There's so many Crusader castles all over. Well, the First Crusade started to liberate Jerusalem from the Muslims, liberate in quotation marks. But then obviously it turned into a sort of search for land and principalities for some of these extra European princes to grab.
Would it look like a castle that we would find in southern Europe?
Crac des Chevaliers is the biggest castle. It's the biggest medieval castle I've ever seen, and I think it might be the biggest one in existence.
It was designed so that
Gothic-
5 knights could ride abreast.
Yes. 5 knights could ride abreast through the hallways. It is monumental, and it's on a very important pass over the mountains. It's gigantic. It's Gothic. It's sort of transitional between the Romanesque and the Gothic era, and the French included it in monuments of France when they made up a list of the monuments of France, because they felt they owned Syria, and certainly this Frankish castle. But there's many other beautiful ones. Lawrence of Arabia, Lawrence wrote a book about Crusader castles, and there's one called Chateau de Saône, which he thought was the best Crusader castle in the world.
But the one that we were just talking about,
Crac des Chevaliers, yes.
was designated a UNESCO World Heritage
Yes.
Site. And after the war broke out in Syria in 2011, didn't a rebel group begin occupying the castle?
Yes.
Is it still in decent shape?
It still serves its function as a place to hold and be besieged. Yes, exactly. Yes, it does.
You're listening to Leonard Lopate at Large, and we were talking about the Crac des Chevaliers. Your photographs of it are just gorgeous. Have there been recent reports that there's been some extensive damage?
Well, yes, there's been extensive damage, but not as extensive as Palmyra. It was bombed, but it can withstand bombing. It's just that it had very decorative Gothic church remains that probably got heavily damaged and other things on the surface.
So to some degree, if anybody ever wants to restore any of these things, they'll have to go to photographs like yours to find out what it looked like before.
Probably so.
Now, Brooke, go ahead, Brooke.
Oh, I can't remember what I was going to say. Never mind.
Well, wasn't the era of the Ottoman rule in the region, about 400 years, considered a relatively peaceful and stable period in Syria's history?
Well, yes, and I think it's the same thing you see all over the former Ottoman Empire and the Austrian Empire too. Is that these countries fall apart once the empire is gone, and the emergence of the strongmen like the first Assad and somebody like what's his name in Iraq.
Saddam Hussein.
Saddam Hussein. I mean, that this is a response to the sort of chaos that took over these countries once they were no longer under the umbrella of the empire and these mixed populations.
Were the French resented when they came in and replaced the Ottoman Empire?
Very much so, yes. As I said, I think they treated it as though it was a colony and not a UN mandate. And there were, if you've seen Lawrence of Arabia, it makes it look as though the Arabs can't govern themselves. But in fact, those conferences they did very well. They had this new King Faisal, whose father had been the Sharif of Mecca, and he was declared king in 1919. And the French ousted him in 1920. And after that, the Syrians were trying to get rid of the French, and they had a number of rebellions that were sort of ruthlessly crushed by the French. And at 1939, the mandate was supposed to end, and then, of course, France was defeated by Germany, and then tried to take over the country again in 1945, and the Syrians appealed to the UN, and the UN said, no, now you're independent.
So 1946, they gained
1946,
total independence.
but the French had suppressed rebellion rather brutally. Yeah.
Damascus and Aleppo both claim to be the oldest continuously inhabited cities in the world. Do we know which one actually was?
No.
And
no.
what are we talking about? How old are they?
8,000 years.
8,000 years.
8,000 years.
Were the cities 8,000 years ago?
Yes. Well, they were called cities. We wouldn't call them that now. They were, yeah.
You compare the Bab Touma district in Damascus to the Latin Quarter in Paris.
It is like that. It's just beautiful and lively, and little restaurants everywhere, and little cafes, and young people wandering around.
And
Yeah.
you visited the Cafe Nofara.
Now, far, that was beautiful.
There was a storyteller there?
Yeah.
Is that a tradition, a public storyteller?
He was the last one. It was a long, long, long tradition, and this guy was known to be the last one who still worked. And it was this beautiful little cafe with fairy lights around it near the mosque. And he told stories and banged on a
What kinds
table.
of stories?
1001 Nights. He told a lot of stories from that. He told a lot of stories about the Sultan Baybars, who was a famous soldier in Islam in Syria. Yeah, and everybody seemed to be familiar with the stories, and they'd shout along with him.
Peter, you mentioned going to the souk. How large is the Al-Hamadiyya souk in Damascus? Is it comparable to a kind of a shopping mall or a public market?
Yeah, maybe even bigger. It's underground, or at least covered, and goes on for kilometers and goes off in different directions.
What kinds of goods are available?
What would you say, Brooke?
Everything. I mean,
Did you buy stuff?
But they have these particular businesses that sell outrageous underwear, and we did buy quite a bit of that. That was hard to resist. And then there's incredible spice markets and just everything you could possibly want: soaps, lotions, salves, clothes, on and on.
The baths are inside there. The caravanserai. It's a place to tie up your camel, which is no longer used for that, but a very beautiful structure.
Do you see camels?
We did in Palmyra.
Yeah, not in Damascus. In more deserty things, but they still used mules. I mean, they were tying up mules in those caravanserais.
Is Aleppo very different, even though it's around the same age as Damascus?
Yes.
Didn't Agatha Christie write Murder on the Orient Express in a hotel in Aleppo?
And I stayed in that hotel when I went back. It's fantastic. It's 1911, pretty much exactly the same way it was. T.E. Lawrence's bar bill is framed in the bar, although he had only lemonade. And I think that's where King Faisal was declared king, from the porch there. It's totally unchanged. It's pretty seedy, but really nice. Had a wonderful time there.
Barron's Hotel.
Yeah, and Charles Lindbergh's room is untouched. Agatha Christie's room is untouched. You can go and look at these rooms. Everybody stayed there.
Peter, you photographed the souk at Aleppo, showing merchant stalls bustling with activities. Is that gone?
Yes, Aleppo is very much devastated, and the souk was very, very badly damaged. It must have gone on for 8 kilometers, and most of it was burned, and it would be very hard to bring all that back again.
And then Palmyra, you said, has been largely destroyed by ISIS. It was once declared one of the 7 wonders of the world. This is an incredible loss.
Well, it's the envy of Rome. It's the ruins of Palmyra were just like what you see in Rome.
But they were like Rome. They were Roman, but they were also, they had their little sort of Eastern Semitic flourishes. So they were always a little, you see camels in the bas-relief and things like that. It was really beautiful. It was unlike anything you could ever see.
And you took pictures of people picnicking at the ruins of Palmyra.
It was interesting.
That won't happen anymore.
No, because where they picnicked has been devastated. But we were there on a weekend, and it was being treated like Central Park. The people of modern Palmyra would go there for their picnic, and you'd see them sitting on blankets, smoking hookah and having lunch, riding camel, riding horses, motorcycles, walking. It was an idyllic scene, actually.
Yeah, it really was. It was incredible. And it's not just ISIS. It's also there's been widespread looting from everybody there. I mean, what we most hear about is ISIS, but they've done what are they called? Those satellite pictures, and you can see just the whole grounds are pockmarked everywhere. Everybody's been looting.
But ISIS saw these as heathen buildings.
Yes.
And aren't Sunni Muslims now the largest religious group in Syria? ISIS is a Sunni group.
Yes, they've always been. I think when we were there, at the time we were there, we were told the country was 75% Sunni, I think 10% Shia, 10% Christian, and 5% other minorities.
So how was Hafez al-Assad able to come to power in 1970? Aren't the Assads members of the Alawite minority, which is a Shiite sect? And there's always tension in these countries between the Shia and the Sunni.
Well, a lot of people don't consider them Shia or even Muslim. A lot of people just thought the Alawites are so weird because they have it's sort of the syncretic religion that has bits of Christianity and Gnosticism and all kinds of strange things. But the Alawites were catered to by the French. The French sort of tried to make nice with the minorities there, so they'd have allies, because since the minorities were not part of the mainstream, they could put them on their side. And they sent people like Assad and sort of bright young men to military academies, which is how he got his start, I think, in the Air Force. And they promoted their careers, and that's how Assad rose up.
And when he died in 2000, his son Bashar became president, but wasn't he in London studying to be an ophthalmologist?
Yes.
It was because his brother, who was expected to become president after their father died, was killed in an automobile accident, that he wound up coming to power. Everybody assumed that he would bring a certain kind of European sensibility to the country.
Well, it did seem like it might happen. The brother seemed to be a bit of a thug, and he was killed, and Bashar seemed like the sort of, sane one who'd gone off to London to become an eye doctor. It's true. And people thought that he would tone down that kind of strong-arm way of running the country, but I don't know. I mean, Peter will tell you that. I mean, one guy we met, one young guy, said, if there's ever a civil war here, it'll be the worst civil war ever, because there are so many factions. It's not just against the government.
Some people said that the reason that the Assads were effective was because they found a way to unite all the different groups rather than to prevent them from going after each other.
Again, it's like Saddam Hussein. I mean, here is a strong man. I mean, they're at least they're able to hold the country together. Now, the Ba'ath Party that the Assads belong to is supposedly socialist and secular. So it was a secular country under Hafiz al-Assad, and he did a big, huge crackdown against the Muslim Brotherhood. Thousands of people killed.
Did you see any evidence throughout the country of a kind of a cult of the Assad family?
Well, you'd see their pictures everywhere, but I'm not sure that the
Were
population felt very strongly about it.
Anybody openly criticize them in your presence?
No.
Well, not openly, but there was a lot of heavy talk, right?
Right. Everyone seems to think if somebody were listening, they could get into trouble.
Yes.
So they modified what they were going to talk to us about.
So you came home, Brooke, rewrote your book, and were recommending a visit to Syria for your friends.
You bet I was.
Were you surprised when that war broke out 2 years later?
Well, I wouldn't say surprised because it seemed, one of those situations where the country was being held together in a difficult manner. But I was sorry it happened so quickly. Yes, and obviously when the Arab Spring stuff started, that was a moment that things could go on fire. Yeah.
What started as just popular opposition to some Assad government policies became a lot more complicated as the battle progressed. To what extent has ISIS played a major role, played any kind of role in all of that, or is part of the problem that there are so many different groups with so many that want so many different things that are all in opposition to the government?
Well, I'm no expert on what's going on there now, but I would say, from what I do know, that there are so many opposition groups. And not to mention Russia and Iran and us and everybody else that's, trying to get their thumb into the pie. So
we talked about the destruction of some of these historic sites, but ISIS has also been looting historical artifacts and selling them on the black market to fund its operations.
And so have the government forces, and so have other groups. Everybody's been part of the looting process. It's just rampant across the country.
All of Syria's...
And Iraq, too, yeah.
Syria has 6 UNESCO World Heritage listed sites: Aleppo's Old City, the Old City of Damascus, Palmyra, Bosra, the Crac de Chevalier, a series of historic villages in northern Syria, all added by UNESCO to its list of World Heritage Sites in danger in 2013. So have all of them been damaged as a result?
They've all been damaged. I mean, Bosra is a place I'd never even heard of. Not Bosra, Iraq, Bosra, Syria. And that was an incredible place to visit. And yes, it's just horrible. You read these places become centers of fighting. Horrible, horrible.
Peter, you said you took these pictures just for personal reasons. When did you realize that your photographs would wind up carrying the weight of historical record?
Well, in 2011, I began to think that something was changing with the importance of these photographs. And first I had a little show in Hudson, New York, where we lived part of the time. And then the war continued. And then it was just the beginning of this year when I realized that Venice Biennale would be a perfect place to show these pictures. And
so that the whole world could see what's been lost.
Right. I was invited to participate, and I thought, if I'm going to show something, it should be this and not modern architectural photography.
Were there some monuments that you wish you had photographed when you'd had the chance?
Yes. First of all, in Palmyra, after 2 hours of shooting, the clouds came over and the infrared wasn't working anymore, so I wished I could have stayed longer, but I didn't. Then there were other places that Brooke went to that she tells me I would have had a field day.
Oh, yes, so many places. So many places, yeah.
I'm speaking to photographer Peter Aaron and writer Brooke Allen about Syria before the deluge. This is WBAI 99.5 FM and in New York. Your photos are currently on view at the Palazzo Mora in Venice through November 25th. Have you received any word of the kind of reaction that people have had to the photos?
The only word I've gotten is that a number of magazines have taken an interest in it and then written it up. One is The New Yorker, when it first opened, did a story with photographs at the end of May, beginning of June. And then Architectural Digest did the same thing. And the Lonely Planet Guide blog did the same thing. The magazine Antiques did a story. So that was affirmation to me that I had struck a chord with the subject matter in these pictures.
And you have worked for most of those magazines in the past, haven't you?
Yes, I've worked for most of what I just mentioned, yes.
Why did you decide to take that second trip to Syria?
Well,
This time you decided to go without your daughters.
well, they were in school. I should have taken them because I got a much better welcome every time I had them with me. But I got back and I started carrying on to everybody that I knew about what an incredible this trip this had been. And I got a call from this guy, Paul Dry, a publisher in Philadelphia. And he asked if I would go back and spend a little more time. He'd like to have me do a travel book. And so...
with the thought that you would be encouraging people
yes, exactly.
to go to
exactly.
the country
He was
as a
really
tourist.
intrigued by everything he'd heard. He was a friend of a friend, and he'd been hearing all this stuff, and he just thought it would make a great travel book. So I got a friend, a school friend of mine that is a great sort of cultural tourist, knows a lot, and we went off, and another friend joined us for a while, and we did these. I mean, we went back and stayed in the Baron Hotel in Aleppo, and we went and stayed in Palmyra for several more days, and at a local hotel, and we went to these fantastic sort of Bronze Age sites, and also these Neo-Hittite mounds and all kinds of odd
What
things.
does a Bronze Age site look like?
Well, it's mostly just the foundations you can see, but they reproduce all these what it looked like, and then there's museums everywhere. The museums alone in Damascus, aside from the fantastic synagogue, there's the first alphabet. You can see the first alphabet at Damascus, which they picked up somewhere along the Mediterranean there. And the first...
From the Phoenicians, I
yes, I guess so. And the first musical notes, the first notated musical notes. You see that right there in the museum. I went to another museum where they had the first realistic human figure that anybody has found. The Sumerian stuff is in the Mesopotamian sculptures. There are all these beautiful, magnificent things. And you just get this. We went to some of these like hilltop places that the Hittites had used as small cities, and the sculptures are just each of these sites has its own style of sculpture, and they're all fantastic. I went to one place in a town called Marat, which I later discovered had been the place where the Crusaders committed cannibalism. It's a famous place for that.
They committed cannibalism?
Yes.
That would go
A
against...
bunch of Crusaders. Well, you got it. There was a PR disaster, right? Yes, for the Crusades. They were eating human babies when they started to get hungry. In that same town, we went to a museum that was nothing but mosaics, Byzantine mosaics that local farmers had dug up in their backyards. And I thought, my goodness, if you saw a collection like that, it would be the Met would do a blockbuster show of this kind of stuff. But there it was all sort of being held together with black plastic bags and things like that. Because all this cultural heritage and no money for anything.
We regret all the looting of Greece and other areas by Europeans, the Elgin marbles in England. But the argument that the British gave was that they were preserving them, and that the areas that they were taking them from were often areas where there were wars, and they might be damaged. It's sad that somebody didn't loot a couple of those things, at least take them out for a time, so they might have been preserved.
But there's a counter argument too, because there's this one guy, a German, who did just that. He he excavated a place, and he got all these quite fabulous sculptures, and he took them all back to Germany and put them in a museum, saying exactly that.
Yeah, in
But
Berlin,
then
you
in
have
Ber-
you
yeah,
have
but then
whole
it was-
buildings in one of the museums.
But
including a temple.
but then his stuff was all blown to pieces because during the war. So the stuff he took from Syria actually was destroyed in World War II. So you never can be too sure, maybe.
When you went back for that second trip, did you attract less attention because you were traveling with friends rather than teenagers?
Yes. Nobody was interested in these two ladies in their 50s, that's for sure.
What, three women traveling alone?
It were two women and a man, but the two women, I mean, people were really nice to us. That's not, I mean, I remember, every time we looked as if we were wanting to sit down and have a cup of tea, people would run out with chairs and sit and talk to us. And we met a lot of interesting people, but it wasn't the same, as being with these two teenage girls. We met some interesting people, many.
And what did they want to talk about?
Well, our favorite guy wanted to talk about poetry, and English poetry and American poetry, and he spouted T.S. Eliot and all this kind of stuff. Everybody, young people. I had made friends with this one young guy who wanted to talk about fashion design all the time. Another one, again, who wanted to talk about poetry. Everybody was eager to talk, and what I found was interesting was nobody sort of lectured us about unpleasant American policies. I think they knew that, it wasn't our fault.
But do you think that they also were very aware of what was going on in the rest of the world?
Yes, absolutely.
What did you hope Americans might learn about Syria when you wrote your book, The Other Side of the Mirror?
Well, just to have an understanding of the world historical culture, because the one thing that everybody asked us before we went and when we came back, do you have to wear a headscarf? Now, it's a lot more interesting a country, as everybody's now hearing, than
Well, how many
whether or
women
not you
there wear headscarves? So
Some did and some didn't.
For example, in Iran, it's you can be stopped by the cops if you're not wearing a
Oh, no,
headscarf.
Syria was not. People dressing in the most outrageous décolletage and things like that. And then other people were completely covered up. It's just, I think when we were there, certainly, it still is. Under the Ba'ath Party, it's a secular country,
But
officially.
Yeah, but right now, a country that has gotten enmeshed in world politics depends on which ally is fighting on which side.
Yeah.
And
Yeah. Who knows what will happen? But, under the Assad regime, the country was officially secular, and you could wear what you choose. It seemed to be about half of people wore headscarves and half didn't.
It seemed about that
But-
way.
and
Yeah.
did anybody object to you photographing?
No, not only that, they hadn't been overexposed like in other countries, like, say, Egypt, so that they didn't shy away or ask for money. They simply were pleased that I was choosing them to be photographed. So that was a throwback to the days before digital and iPhones.
Now, you only have a selection of photographs at the Venice Biennale. How many more are out there, and are they as beautiful as the ones that are in that exhibit?
The exhibit has 40 pictures, and they're all black and white, and most of them are infrared, whereas I have something like 5 times or 10 times more images that are, I think, strong, and a lot of them are in color, so it would be a completely different kind of exhibition if I dredge those out of the archives.
And you said that you've been approached by magazines like The New Yorker. Is it likely that we will see any of those pictures?
Well, I'll have to make the effort to show those around before anyone's going to jump on that.
What project are you working on right now? I imagine something totally different from Syria.
Well, basically, I've made my living shooting architecture for architects and interior designers, and so far I don't see how switching to art photography is going to allow me to continue to make decent wages. So I've been to galleries and to publishers. I just don't see how that's a way to survive in an expensive world. So my next project is to begin shooting some more for my architects.
And Brooke, you have another book in the works?
No, I don't, actually. I've been teaching at Bennington College the last few years. I'm just laying off of that, and I write a lot of, I'm a freelance writer.
Well, that brings us to the end of this show. My great thanks to today's guests, Brooke Allen and Peter Aaron, Charlie Morrow, who composed our theme music. My great thanks to Reggie Johnson, who's at the audio controls, to my assistant producer, Jesse Lent, who makes things run smoothly. Leonard Lopate at Large comes to you on Saturdays at 4 and Tuesdays at noon. You can subscribe to Leonard Lopate at Large podcast on iTunes and by clicking on Robin Hood Radio's archive program site, which is robinhoodradio.com. You can also check out Leonard Lopate at Large Facebook page. We hope to see you next week.